Well, when we're young, we never think that this day will come, isn't it? That we bury one of our parents, but of course it's inevitable, and so here we are today. And indeed, on behalf of the Choa family, I'd like to give you a warm welcome here this morning, and thank you very much for coming along in support of our family and to pay our respects to my father, Robert Choa. So I want to mention that your visitations and your messages, or your flowers and meals and generosity and support, especially of my mother, has been really overwhelming. It is overwhelmingly good, and it's been a great comfort to her. And so, by extension, it's been a comfort as well for Shirley and myself, knowing that my mum has such a good support network. Indeed, we also appreciate the many messages from family and friends in the Netherlands and Indonesia. And I want to thank also my father's close friends who, particularly in the last year of his life, they kept visiting him, kept calling us to inquire of him. And I think these friendships and those interactions really helped him to have some enjoyment and to keep going perhaps for a bit longer than otherwise may have been the case. Special thank you also to Shirley's sister-in-law Rose, who was right there at the end, at the utmost difficult time for us, and giving care and support not only for us at that time, but also having done so for my father himself in the last months of his life. So we'll never forget what you've done for us. Sorry, it's beginning to sound a bit like an Academy Awards speech, but a word of thank you also to the palliative care team who cared for my father, and as well as David and all his colleagues at Australian Pensioner Funerals. I want to make a special mention for my mother Joyce as well, who stood by her husband and took care of him right up to the last moment in very difficult conditions. Not only emotionally stressful, of course, for her to see him deteriorate and tending constantly to his needs, 24/7. Also physically difficult for her, having to sort of lift him up out of bed and things like that because of his restricted mobility, not getting much sleep and rest. So it was really difficult for her. So we could see she was getting to the end of her tether. But to his credit, my father also realized this as well. You may not know, but his wish all along was to stay at home and not go into a nursing home or external care. Rather, he wanted to remain at home, which is the house that the home that he built up over the last 35 years or so, into which he felt a very strong connection. But indeed, a few days before his passing, he acknowledged that, yes, it was getting very hard for my mum, and that perhaps going into some sort of external care was perhaps the only option left for him. In other words, that's how difficult things had gotten, that he was coming to that conclusion. So a big thank you and kudos to my mum for enduring right to the end and looking after him. And lastly, just to thank you again for anyone who may have forgotten to mention. Please know that anything you did or said for our family is really appreciated by us. Thank you very much. So then let's consider some facts about my father's life. He was survived by his wife, Joyce Lestari, son Jeffrey, daughter Shirley, son-in-law Glenn, daughter-in-law Astrid, grandson Ashley, and also he has a sister, Trace. He was born on 22nd of January 1942 in Jakarta, Indonesia. He was the youngest of 7 siblings, having 5 brothers and 1 sister. Now, Robert and Joyce met as young teenagers, and with his mother and brothers having already migrated to Holland, they then also followed them and got married over there in 1968. So the following year, son Jeffrey was born, and then followed 3 years later by daughter Shirley. Robert worked in a glass factory for a while before eventually ending up as an industrial chemist at Unilever, testing soaps and detergents in the laboratory there. So in the late 1970s, his brother-in-law, Ted, made a life-changing invitation to our family to come for a holiday here in Melbourne. And so during this trip, my father really liked it here, or he loved it here, and he realized that here was an opportunity for a new life for him and his family. And so he left behind all of his extended family and friends in Holland, and so the family moved here to Melbourne in 1982 to begin a new life. And then soon Robert settled into work once again, working in a laboratory, testing chemicals for the paper manufacturing industry. And he continued that particular work until his retirement. Unfortunately, having been a smoker since he was about 12, about 20 years ago, my father developed emphysema, which is a chronic lung disease that has symptoms such as shortness of breath and coughing and gradual physical decline over a long period of time. And ultimately, that's what claimed him. It was just after midnight on 14 May, he was 77 years old. So those are the plain facts of Robert's life, but our family would like to share with you what he was like as a person, as a tribute to him and in celebration of his life. So I apologize a little bit in advance. You'll hear a few personal experiences from me, so it may sound like I'm talking a lot about myself, but yeah, please focus on what the story is telling us about my father. It's all about him today, isn't it? Well, he was a quiet man, not someone who liked to be the center of attention. He wasn't a jovial kind of a guy who would just charm everybody in the whole room. And this happens to be a bit of a Choa family characteristic, at least among the men, I think. I remember one time when we went back to Holland for a holiday and visiting his older brothers. They had three of them, three brothers, sitting on the sofa, and it was almost total silence. I was watching them. I think, they're brothers. They haven't seen each other for a long time. Why aren't they talking? What's going on? But as I kept watching, you could sort of sense there was no malice or awkwardness between them. It was just how they were. That's just how they felt comfortable with one another. And like I said, it's just a family trait, I think. I've learned since that his father, in fact, was of similar nature, so sort of preferring his own sort of company and sort of staying in his room much of the day, playing chess against himself, as you do, and occasionally coming out for a smoke. So it really seems to run in the family. Now, my father also wasn't the type to sort of put his arms around you and say, "Oh, I love you, son." Of course, as a child, I could see that difference between him and maybe the fathers we could see on the television sitcoms. To my mum's credit, though, she would explain to me that while my father was a bit quiet and he sort of didn't always express himself in that way, that he really loved and cared for us. So I never felt unloved, and I'm sure he feels the same. So in that sense, my father wasn't a talker, but he was a doer. So like just about every young boy in Holland, I joined a local soccer club, and so we would play home and away games on the weekend. And he would take me to almost every game himself. And also, he wouldn't just drop me off at the game and then go home again to tend to his own hobbies, but he would stay and watch the game, and often we would stay behind a little bit afterwards, have a bit of lunch in the canteen, the club canteen, and he let me play on the pinball machine there. I remember that, and then we'd go back home together. So maybe at the time I took, being just a young kid, I took it a bit for granted, sort of assuming that's what fathers do. All fathers do that for their sons. But of course, looking back on it, it was a special time really, and an indication of his loving care and interest. Later on in Australia, when Shirley joined the tennis club, he did exactly the same thing. He gave her the exact same support. So he really had that involvement and interest in his children's lives. As I said, not so much spoken or verbalized, but fully evident in his actions. So he was an excellent father, something which Shirley was able to convey to him in the last weeks of his life. The soccer story there reminds me too of a little incident that shows he had a strong sense of what was right, and that he wanted to teach his children to be well behaved and doing the right thing. So during one of my soccer games, we weren't playing so well, and everyone was a bit on edge and a little bit short-tempered, shall we say. And our coach was a young guy in his early 20s, not the mature age coaches that we usually had and who we were quite respectful towards. Sort of like I said, a young guy, and he was sort of fair game. So our coach was yelling some instructions from the sidelines, and nothing abnormal about that, nothing abusive or anything, just perfectly normal. Anyway, he called out to me, and I was very annoyed, and I yelled back something to him, something like, "What do you want now?" I was very quite rude to him, in fact. And after the match, I could see my father was not pleased with me, that is. And he told me, you can't talk to your coach like that. You should apologize. And but he's just a young guy, Dad. It doesn't matter. You can't talk to your coach like that. So maybe my father didn't talk much, but he certainly spoke out when it mattered. This brings me to something else that says a lot about my father, which was his work ethic. So he wasn't so much driven by ambition to be, the top man, the top dog, but rather, I think, by his desire to provide for his family. It's a bit ironic that actually, as a young child and a teenager in Indonesia, he didn't put much effort into schoolwork, often preferring to skip school and hang out with his friends. And I'm guessing his teachers must have thought he was probably, heading towards being a sort of a good-for-nothing, lazy bum. But as he got older, he straightened up and wanted to prove to, particularly to his future father-in-law, that he was going to be a worthy son-in-law to be, who would be able to provide for his family. So in addition to his daytime work, he attended many night school classes and courses to better himself and to improve his job prospects. He worked very hard at that and achieved very good results. We actually found an old folder recently full of his old night school reports and reference letters from work in companies he worked for. And they emphasize his industriousness and hard-working nature, which was certainly a credit to him. Early in his working life in Holland, he worked in a glass factory, which was very physically demanding and quite an unpleasant job. Furthermore, he did a lot of night shift work, both in Holland and here in Australia, especially when we just arrived here and he was trying to get established. And so shooting back between Holland and Australia. Remember too that in Holland we lived in an apartment building without undercover parking. So all the cars were parked in the car park outside. So every day at about 6:30 in the morning, in the middle of freezing winter, he would walk out there to his car, and often there would be this thick layer of snow and ice on the windscreen, which he would then first have to scratch off and remove before he could drive to work. And I remember we'd all watch him from the kitchen window and sort of wave him goodbye as he drove off. Anyway, the point of all this is that he was a man willing to work very hard and take on whatever it was needed in terms of work in order to provide for his family, which he did very well. Just like to share with you a fact now that when my father was in his late teens, one of his older brothers suddenly died in a car accident, leaving behind a young daughter and two young boys, his niece and his two nephews. So my father took them under his wing, even though he himself was still of a young age. And especially with his two nephews, he sort of formed a special bond with them. He could be, it says it could be a bit tough, but I think he was quite tough on them. And they received plenty of old-style discipline, if you know what I mean. But they turned out exceptionally well, and to this day they're grateful for what he did for them. So his nephew Paul and his wife Renee flew out from Holland late last year to come and see him, and it was great for my father to be able to see them one last time. His other nephew Roy wrote him a very moving letter, acknowledging that Robert was was a father figure to him, and he concluded that letter with the statement, "You're always with me, you are not alone." Such was the positive and lasting impact that he had on their lives. So that sort of story really makes me sort of proud as a son to have had a father like that. There's a photo of my father actually reading that particular letter, and you can see that he was very moved by it, and emotional, some happy tears. And so this may come as a bit of a surprise that my father, the quiet man, and sometimes I think I know what was up there. So the quiet man, and sometimes the emotional man, sometimes the annoyed man who would yell at you. So it was a bit of a surprise that yes, he had such an emotional side to him. I sort of first noticed that for myself when on another trip to Holland we visited the grave of his mother, my grandmother, and I think being the youngest in his family, or the youngest sibling, he sort of always had that sort of special sort of connection with his mother. And quiet as he usually was, he went even quieter, if that's possible, went even quieter and even more introspective as we entered the cemetery. And looking at him, I'm sure many emotions and many memories must have come flooding back to him. So seeing that, it helped me to understand him better, that he wasn't just a father, as in a label father, but he was like a real human being with feelings, and these feelings often ran very deep. Saying that, he indeed could be, he could be a bit stern, and he could get annoyed with people, especially if he thought they were doing silly things. And indeed, as he did with his nephews, he certainly didn't spare me from that old-style discipline when required. But I think I turned out okay, so no hard feelings. And in fact, I'm grateful to him for teaching me well. I will always carry that with me. Moving on to lighter matters, as you may perhaps have noticed from the pictures running behind me, my father had a few hobbies in life, and particularly loved motorcycles and racing them. And as a young lad, he would put his motorbike in his parents' living room, as you do, and then would work on fixing it or tuning it, deep into the night. And everyone in the house had to sort of carefully walk around it so as not to disturb all of the, all the parts and the nuts and bolts that were lying on the floor. And then, when he'd finished, in the middle of the night, he would take it out for a test drive, and he would sort of roar around the streets of Jakarta. So we can imagine the feeling of sort of freedom and youth and excitement he would have felt. A few months ago, by now sort of confined to bed for most of the time, he asked me to get a particular Elvis movie for him. And in this movie, Elvis rides a motorcycle, which is the same model that my dad once owned, a Honda. And there's a scene early on in the film. Elvis is riding through some beautiful countryside. And I was watching my father's face as he was watching that scene. And so that look of joy and sort of excitement in his eyes and on his face, it was really priceless to see. As I'm sure that while he was watching that scene, I think he was maybe reliving some of his youth and that feeling of freedom and exuberance he would have had riding that motorbike as a young man. So indeed, there are many more stories we could tell, but unfortunately time marches on. But I hope that these little stories or vignettes, anecdotes, they paint a little bit of a picture of the type of man my father was. And I think I can sum up by saying that he was an excellent man, excellent father and husband, and indeed a grandfather. So with that, I'd like to share with you now a brief letter that his grandson Ashley had written for his grandfather. And in fact, Ashley will read it for us. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you all for coming. My Opa was a very important person to me. While he was a very loving and generous grandpa, that's not what I will miss most from him. I will miss our little talks, even though they weren't deep talks, but they were special ones. These talks could be talking from what was on the local news to making fun of the contestants on My Kitchen Rules, and our ongoing argument about which soccer team was better, Netherlands or Chile. Obviously Chile was better. He was also responsible for giving me some of my first things in my life, such as my first PlayStation 3, which to me at the time was the best thing you could get as a kid, and to my first car, which now as a teenager is the best thing you could get as well. And I will always remember that. I loved him very much, and it hurts me that I didn't get to say it enough to him when he was still with us. Also regret not visiting him enough during his last weeks of his life, and that's a regret that I have to live with. I hope that one day we will be able to see him again, and I look forward to my kids to meet both of their great-grandfathers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ashley, for those heartfelt words and for coming up here and reading them yourself. It's a really nice touch. Thank you very much. And we can see Ashley touching there on sort of feelings of loss and regret, which I'm sure we all have in common at times like this. Always wondering if we could have said more or done more, or said this or done that. That's just part of life. Perhaps for those who may not be aware, Ashley mentioned about the Bible-based hope of a resurrection, which such that we can meet our dead loved ones again. So that's what he was referring to. My father wasn't an especially religious person. He was baptized as a Catholic, but never really practiced as such. But he did wonder a bit about what would happen at death. Was there an afterlife, and so forth. And in typical fashion, he didn't really verbalize that thought or that concern, but instead he cracked a little joke, that the devil was going to take him. But I've no doubt that this little joke probably masked some sort of deep feelings about the issue. And so among other things, in the conversation with Shirley, she was able to convey to him, as I mentioned before, that he had been a good man, a good father, which I'm sure made him very happy to hear that. I see Ashley mentioned My Kitchen Rules. two things about that is we can get a glimpse of sort of slightly evil sense of humour my dad had sometimes. But also he loved TV. Can I just mention that, because I'm sure he wouldn't want to let this talk pass without mentioning TV. Not so much that he loved watching TV, but I think he loved TV as like a piece of technology, and in itself, and then all the accessories that went with it. You can imagine in the early 1970s, we just had a very basic black and white television, no remote control. Then as technology advanced, he moved up to a colour TV with remote control. Then the big screen, the flat screen, the plasma, the LCD, the 3D, and then all the accessories that went with it, the video recorder, then the DVD player, the top box, the media player, sound bar. And the thing is, all these things had their own remote control. And since he had a TV in just about every room in the house, he accumulated a gazillion remote controls. I think he ended up with the largest collection of remote controls in the world. I would say one of the things I most dreaded was him asking me, can you please find such and such DVD player or that piece of equipment, and can you swap it with that one and just hook it up for me? And it would be the most frustrating hour. He would be sorting through this maze of cables behind the equipment to try and find what cable plugs in where, and also looking all over the house, my goodness, for the right remote control. So we'd have to get this whole box of remote controls, and so which one is it, tested, and But and also he would watch you as you were doing it too, and tell you that you were doing it wrong. He said, no, that cable doesn't go there. You've got to use that cable, and no, don't do that. You've got to do it like this. So at the time, yes, a little bit frustrating perhaps. But at one point, I remember thinking, one day I'll miss all of this. Of course, now I'd give anything for him to ask me to hook up a DVD player. Of course, it's those little things that we miss, like Ashley said. And so in that way, missing him, longing for his presence, that way we will always remember him. We can never forget. So thank you, friends and family, for your support and your attention and your attendances this morning. Really appreciate it. You've been seeing some pictures and video clips of my father on screen, and wasn't he a dashing young man, racing motorcycles, looking very cool in his sunnies and wavy hair. So yes, if we now please could play a final clip in tribute of him, and when you see it, I've sent him back in time, so to speak. You'll see him getting younger and younger, and so that's how we'd like to remember him in his prime, forever young. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your attention. Just a quick announcement, dear friends. After the service concludes, you're welcome to linger a little bit, and then at 12 noon, please make your way to the Redwood function room, which is just over the road on my right, and join us there for some refreshments. So there we can talk a bit more and perhaps share some stories about my father with one another, and please, if you have any funny stories or anecdotes about him, I would love to hear them. So thank you, friends. Now it really is time to say goodbye to my father. His wish was to be cremated, and that part of his ashes be strewn about in the cemetery in Holland, where his mother and brothers are also resting, and they will, of course, comply with his wish. So, indeed, as we see my father depart, we'll hear a song. It's I think it's sung in Malaysian, actually, I believe, but very similar to Indonesian. And that song is about displaced people, longing to return to their homeland. So, in light of my father's wishes, that seems very apt, doesn't it? So, goodbye, my father. Thank you for all you've done for us. We will never forget you. Thank you. Thank you, friends. That concludes the service. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for sharing your brother with us.
Thank you.